reading from the Holy Gospel according to St. Mark. Returning from the district of Tyre, Jesus went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee, right through the Decapolis region. And they brought him a deaf mute who had an impediment in his speech, and they asked him to lay hands on him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, put his fingers into the man's ears, and touched his tongue with spittle. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephata, that is, be opened. And his ears were opened, and the ligament of his tongue was loosened, and he spoke clearly. And Jesus ordered them to tell no one about it. But the more he insisted, the more widely they published it. Their admiration was unbounded. He had done all things well, they said. He makes the deaf hear and the dumb speak. We return once again today to the Gospel of St. Mark after some weeks of reflecting on the Bread of Life discourse in St. John's Gospel. And today we find Jesus once again in a healing role. He had the power to not only forgive sin but also to heal people. But we also know that Jesus was vulnerable, and here in the Pieta we see the vulnerable Jesus, the Jesus in his mother's arms as he suffers. But this Gospel today, I think, is in a way is a parable. Jesus has been away to the district of Tyre, and he's going back by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee through the Decapolis region. And the people bring him a man that had an impediment in his speech, and they ask him to heal him. And Jesus takes him away in private, away from the crowds. And we notice later on that Jesus tells them, after the miracle, not to tell anyone. And Jesus puts his fingers into the man's ears and touches his tongue, and then in a gesture looks to heaven and says, Ephata, be opened. And the man was healed. I think this is a kind of parable because, as we know, at the time of Jesus, the occupying power of that particular area were the Romans. And the Romans were hated by the Jews, by the majority of them. But of course some of them collaborated with them, collected tax. And we know how hated the tax collectors were. And what happens when an occupying power, not only do they take the power from the people, but often their way of life, their customs and even their language are forced upon those who they lord it over. And I think this is a kind of parable because it's challenging those who were collaborating with the Romans to be open because they had forgotten about the needs of their own people. And so as they collected the taxes and other things which they did on behalf of the occupying force, they had forgotten about the needs of the people who were part of them. And so that was the great message that Jesus gave, I think, in this parable today, that he had the power to free people. He had the power to enable them to be open to what was happening around them. And we see that the crowd's admiration was unbounded, that he had done all things well. And so once again we find Jesus freeing people from whatever it was that was binding them. In this particular case it was the man who could not hear, who could not speak. Jesus also does that to us in our lives. If we embrace the person of Christ, we too can be open to those and the things around us.